Hey everyone, and welcome back. Now, I've just discovered that my laptop has some really quite nice screen capture software on it. So that means that I can take you on some trips through memory lane, through history of how different WSUD assets have evolved and changed over time, because it's really instructive for us figuring out what works, what doesn't work, etc. And so, to kick us off, I'm probably going to make a few videos like this, but to kick us off, we're going to have a look at the Hoyland St bioretention system. Now, this is the second oldest bioretention system in Australia. It's in Brisbane's northern suburbs. It was constructed in 2001, shortly after a system had been built in Melbourne. So, second oldest system in Australia, built in 2001, and that makes it essentially 25 years old. And I was fortunate enough that I first visited this system in 2010 when the system was about 9 years old. And I've continued to visit it over time since then, which means I have a photo record of this system over about 16 years now. So we can really see it evolve and change. And there are a few really good lessons to come from it. So I'm going to take you through the photos over that period of time, and then we'll talk about those lessons at the end. So things you should know here. This photograph you're seeing here is an overview of the system. So it's the sunken down area that we see in front of us there with the melaleuca trees, lomandras in the understory, and there are also acacia trees. So it was originally planted with the melaleucas and the lomandras, and then the acacias came in from seed and grew up and contributed to the canopy there. It drains a residential subdivision that is out of shot to the right. And the other thing that's probably worth bearing in mind, although it doesn't seem to really have had an influence on this system, but we'd be remiss not to talk about it, is the fact that this system is just a little bit bigger relative to its catchment than most that are built in Queensland these days. So most bioretention systems in Queensland will be around 1 to 1.5% of the catchment. This bioretention system, its filter media area is about 4% of the contributing catchment, if I remember correctly. I could be a little bit out on the number, but it's in that sort of ballpark. But as I say, I don't think that influences the story, but we'd be remiss not to mention it. So we have this overview picture of the system in 2010. And if we start skipping forward here, we now have this photograph where we can pick out the melaleuca trees, the paper barks here with the light colored bark, the acacias kind of hiding in the system there with the darker colored bark. There are quite a few, even though this photo doesn't show it. Lomandras in the understory, and in this particular photograph, we have some terrestrial weeds coming in from the edges, terrestrial grasses, so some edge effects happening. But if we skip forward 1 year to 2011, a little bit deeper in the system, this is really typical of what this system looked like at the time. Lomandras, relatively clear in the understory, around the lomandras, lots of leaf drop on the system there, suppressing weed growth. And you can see good numbers of acacias here, really contributing to the canopy, like so. It's worth pointing out here that I've spoken over the years to the maintenance coordinator for this asset, and at this point in time, it was essentially not receiving any maintenance except for litter picking. So the system probably got some maintenance for the first year or two of its life as it was establishing. But after that, through until this period here, it was receiving no maintenance for weed control. And that's really important to know, just some litter picking in it. And we have an asset that really doesn't have many weeds in it except around the edge. So we're seeing the canopy, the leaf drop, the shade, suppressing weeds within the system. And on the edges where there is a bit more sunlight, we're getting terrestrial weeds coming in from the edges, but nothing major. The system's held up with essentially no weed control for the best part of 7 or 8 years probably at this point. Now, seems like I didn't visit the system for a couple of years here, and we skip forward to 2014, and things are starting to change. We can see here now that there are more terrestrial weeds getting further into the system. We can also see that the canopy has thinned out a little bit here. So what happened is the acacias that came up in the system, they're a pioneer species, they're a relatively short-lived tree, and at this point in time, they started dying, and eventually they started falling over, but they started dying, and therefore they're not providing the same amount of shade into the center of the system as it was, and we started to be able to see the terrestrial weeds getting further in. Now, there are certainly at this point, 2014, still plenty of parts of this basin, particularly towards the back end, that were really resilient to weeds, but there was certainly, we started to see the first signs of this additional weed ingress that hadn't been there in the period of 2004 to 2011 sort of thing. We'll skip forward. It's just worth also pointing out here that this is one of the first systems I ever really started to notice the beneficial effects of leaf drop on the filter media. See leaves landing on the filter media surface, breaking down, forming an horizon, making the filter media a bit more hospitable. Now, Hoyland Street's media is probably just in general more hospitable than contemporary filter media because it was built before the filter media specifications that we currently use were released. But nonetheless, you can see this horizon developing. Skip forward to 2015. It's really important to note here that we started to get a vineweed infestation near the inlet. So the inlet's just out of shot to the right here. Almost certainly some weed seed came in, got established near the inlet, and started climbing up the trees around the inlet there. And this photo, again from 2015, I just have it in here to kind of demonstrate these acacias that are, had died off, started to fall. In this case, fell on a young Melaleuca and broke it. But there are parts of the system that's still not doing too badly here. So we see, edge effects of the grassy weeds. We see some lantana on the edge. There's also bits, it's not like it's completely overrun by weeds through the center. And we still see Lomandra surviving. Melaleucas are doing great, lovely flowers in this photo, etc. We skip forward to 2016 and we notice this for the first time. This is a tuckaroo that has self-seeded into the system. Almost certainly the seed came in from the catchment upstream because the predominant street tree in the upstream catchment is tuckaroos. There are dozens and dozens of them. So almost certainly they've dropped some seed and it's got into the system and germinated. If you want to dig back through my old Ideanthera videos, you will find a video filmed by Ben Peneluric and I on the day in 2016 where we first found this self-seeding and germinating. It's a trip down memory lane for me. It's the best part of a decade ago. At this point in time, it was just like one or two of these in the system. And I just threw this photo in here to show this is taken right down near the back end of the system to show that towards the back of the system, there was still some resilience going there. But, we see the Melaleuca trees, we see some, and a fallen acacia, we see some Lomandras, but there's plenty of weedy grasses through it as well. Skip forward to 2017. I don't actually remember taking this photograph, but it's a photograph of an acacia that appears to have come up from seed on the batters. I don't know for sure what happened to this over time, but the present day in 2026, there are still some acacias in the system. It suggests that maybe some came up from seed around this point in 2017 and have now grown towards maturity. But I don't know that for sure, one way or the other. What we do see in 2017 is those original tuckaroos are continuing to grow, continuing to be quite nice and healthy and get established. That's not the one I showed you in the previous photograph, but the one in the previous photograph is also growing up. 2018 here, really just showing this to demonstrate that we still have a vineweed problem at the front of the system here. As much as talk about canopy showing systems to be resilient to weed ingress, canopy is not going to stop a vigorous vineweed. That needs to be controlled. And what you can see here in this photograph in 2018 then is, again, the understory is continuing to be dominated by terrestrial weeds, but we actually, if you look closely, can now see quite a few tuckaroos popping up. One on the left, 2, 3, probably 4 there. There's maybe a fifth under there, and there's quite a few popping up as of 2018 in this photograph alone. And then I left the industry for a bit, didn't visit this site for the best part of 8 years or so, but I returned earlier this year in 2026. And, actually, before we go there, that is the original tuckaroo that I showed you a photograph of from 2016, just showing that it's continuing to grow. Then I didn't visit it for a while, and I returned in 2026. And there's been some interesting changes here that we can talk about. So we have an overview photograph of the system. I believe that is taken from near the inlet. The first thing you can notice is that the vine weeds have been controlled. So there has at least been some evidence of attempts to manage weeds within the system here. Now, how frequently, etc., that's to be questioned. We can also see, you'll see in a lot of photographs, browning off around the batters. So pretty decent evidence that someone's spraying around the batters. I think someone's probably identified that obviously the inlet is a source of weeds into the system, but the batters are too. But by this point, there's lots of terrestrial weeds in the understory. The understory itself is now a source of weeds for the system. Just brief detour into this photograph to show that, you can still see the under drains, and they were trickling out that day because it had rained previously. Now, this is a photograph of the back end of the system, and you can see more of what I was talking about. So there's, probably some spraying happening on the batters there. Terrestrial weeds in the understory. We've seen all of this. This photograph gives us a better indication that the understory now is completely overrun by terrestrial weeds. But if you find a spot where you can get down into the filter media, you can see this continued development of O-horizon, etc. And the filter media is still feeling lovely and porous. There's absolutely no signs that this system's clogging up or has any drainage issues. What is interesting, but which is really, really hard to get on a photograph interesting, is that there are now dozens and dozens and dozens of tuckaroos coming up through the system. They're taking their time, but they're getting there. In this photograph alone, you can see multiples, some of which are getting to pretty good sizes going on in here. So we've got this continued thing of like the tuckaroos have got in, got some seed, got established. The ones in the system are probably dropping seeds themselves. They're finding a spot they really like to grow, and they're doing well. I'll come back to that photograph in a second. And so what this leads us to is a few potential conclusions. I might just zoom out to this photograph here as I talk conclusions here. We've seen the system go through possibly 3 distinct phases in its life so far. We had there was probably a very first phase in the first year or two where there was regular maintenance being done to get the thing established. Then there was a period from approximately probably like 2003 through to somewhere around 2010, 2011, which we might refer to as the resilience years, where we had quite a thick canopy in the system of melaleucas and acacia, and it was really resilient to weed ingress. Then we have what we might call the thinning years, where the acacias died, the canopy thinned out, we saw lots of weeds come into the system. And maybe, just maybe, and then in the final years here, we have the some weed control system here, where we see there's some management of understory weeds in different parts of the system. It's certainly not on a really regular, really proactive maintenance run, but there's a bit being done to kind of just keep on top of things. And then potentially there's an era that we're entering here of like tuckaroos really growing up. So what are our takeaway lessons from this system? One of which is that canopy can definitely suppress weed growth in bioretention systems, but it needs to reach a certain minimum density. So subsequently, I've done some poking around that found for systems that were planted with trees such as melaleucas, there appears to be a threshold at somewhere around 1 tree per 15 square meters, where if you have trees more densely than that in the system, they seem to form sufficient canopy to close in, shade it out, etc. If you are at less density than that, then it doesn't seem to be quite enough to suppress the weeds. Now, obviously, that is highly dependent on tree species, and there are also systems that are planted much more densely than that are showing this resilience. But it feels like for the Melaleuca quinquenervis and like there's a threshold about 1 per 15 square meters. And so if I was trying to plant a system to be resilient to weed ingress, I'd go a fair whack more dense than that there. It's also worth noting here that there are 2 spots really that weeds got into this system via the front end, the stormwater inlet. That is always going to be the case on every bioretention system. There are weed seeds in runoff from the catchment. It gets into bioretention. But we also saw terrestrial weeds come in off the batters. And this particular system, as resilient as it was, the batters were never planted, and it had a direct interface between the planted area and grassy turf. If you want to make a system resilient to weed ingress, I would strongly suggest that you want trees up the batters, maybe even a tree like a casuarina that's got some allelopathic properties that will suppress weed growth underneath it, and then probably some kind of concrete maintenance edge or gravel maintenance path around the edge, so there's no direct interface between turf and the edge of the planted area there. Another takeaway from it is that 25 years in, there is absolutely no sign that this system is clogging up. And then the final takeaway for me is, well, what's happening with the tuckaroos? There is continued change and succession going on here. It makes me wonder, well, where might the tuckaroos take this system in the future? And I want to flick forward now and show you a photograph. So I visited my 2026 visit to Hoyland St. Happened, I forget whether it was late February or early March now, but I subsequently went and visited some bioretention systems at North Lakes, which is a bit further north again, just a couple of weeks ago. So that was mid-March 2026, and stumbled across this area. So this is not a bioretention system. This is just a bit of kind of riparian corridor between two bioretention systems as I was walking down the footpath. And what struck me is these are all tuckaroos. And look at the density of those stems in there. It just strikes me that in Hoyland St, we've gone from 2016, the first sign of a tuckaroo coming up in the system, to 2026, there's probably 30, 40, 50 of them in the system. Is it going to continue to dense up with tuckaroos and ultimately end up something like this? Might we actually see the canopy close in again in 10 years' time, and actually start to see the system suppress the weed growth within it once more, but with a longer lived species like the tuckaroos? I don't know, but it feels like it's heading at least somewhat in that direction. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on. And that's my lessons from Hoyland St these days. Canopy makes such a big difference to suppressing weed ingress. You just got to get it dense enough. Batter design so we don't get weeds coming in off the batters. And let's keep an eye on these tuckaroos.